I say we just start. Welcome everybody to an afternoon at the Lagoon. I am Kate Bimrose, the Bolinas Lagoon Program Coordinator for the Greater Farallones Association. We are the nonprofit partner of the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. We help to preserve sanctuary habitat and wildlife through science, environmental education, and community-based conservation. We're going to start the day off with our Executive Director, Deb Self.
Thanks, Kate. Hi, everyone. I'm Deb Self. I'm the Executive Director of Greater Farallones Association, and I am very excited to welcome you to the third in our online series highlighting the incredible native wildlife and habitats and ecosystems of Bolinas Lagoon, which, like Kate said, is part of the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. Our first two events showcased the fascinating native wildlife that lives in the lagoon or that migrates through, and we took you on a tour of some of our restoration projects. If you missed either of those first two events, you can watch recordings by visiting our website, and we'll actually add a link to the chat box right now if you want to go in there and click on it and save it for later. Today, in our third event, we'll be focusing on the different ways that we're partnering with the sanctuary and with the local community and the County of Marin to restore and enhance the lagoon's ecosystems. I hope you enjoy the webinar, and I'm really proud of our team and excited about this project, and hope that you enjoy digging in a little deeper to the more technical aspects and values of working with nature to restore our ecosystems and make them more resilient to climate change. Okay, well, thanks. Have a great time, and I'll hand it back over to Kate. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you, Deb. Okay, so today's event will be broken into 4 different parts. First, we're going to talk about the importance of estuaries and why marshes matter. Then we're going to talk a bit about the future challenges and impacts those special places face. Then we'll dive into the science behind living shorelines as natural solutions to those impacts. And then we'll wrap up the event with a case study of our South End Living Shorelines project to showcase how we plan to address impacts in Bolinas Lagoon. Before we begin, a couple logistics. Our team today includes Deb, our Executive Director, whom you already met, myself, Kate Bimrose, the Bolinas Program Coordinator. Our tech support team is Olivia Johnson and Elaine Chappell. And my fellow presenters are Sarah Hutto, our Ocean Climate Program Coordinator, and Dr. Wendy Cordish, our Geological Oceanographer. As usual, we're going to record this event, and as soon as that recording is ready, we will post it to our YouTube channel. So I'll be sure to send everybody an email once that recording is up. If you have any trouble hearing us or viewing the presentation, use the chat box and either Olivia or Elaine will troubleshoot any problems you have. You're all muted, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to hear your thoughts. So please continue to use that chat box throughout the presentation to type in any questions you have. And at the end of tonight's event, we will try and get to as many questions as we can. So let's see who's with us today. When you all first registered, we asked where you'll be tuning in from. And it looks like most of you are outside of Marin County, but still hailing from the Golden State. We do have a good mix of local folks who live in West Marin, and even one person tuning in from another state, Washington. So welcome everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us. Let's dive in and start talking about our estuaries. Estuaries are some of the most productive ecosystems in the world. They're places where the rivers meet the sea, where fresh and salt water mix, bringing unique plants and animals from both systems to one location. This salty freshwater mix is where life begins, and it's the nursery grounds for 75% of the fish we catch. Estuaries are also breeding and feeding grounds for many marine and land-based mammals and birds. Bolinas Lagoon is a pupping site for roughly 200 harbor seals each year. It hosts 50,000 migratory birds a year and 245 bird species year-round. Not to mention the 23 rare, endangered, and threatened species that utilize its 1,100 acres. Estuaries are important not just for wildlife, but for humans too, because they offer wonderful recreation activities like bird watching, hiking, and kayaking that I'm sure many of you have enjoyed. They are also a huge economic resource tied to the ocean economy. Many of the products that we all use pass through one or more estuaries on a commercial shipping vessel before ever reaching our home. Just think of San Francisco Bay. Coastal counties, excluding Alaska, house 40% of the nation's population, which is almost 70% of California's population on coastal counties. These coastal counties generate 60% of the country's GDP, $2 trillion of which is generated in California alone. Estuaries are home to several habitat types, from wetlands, meaning wetland, to the uplands, up on the land. The gently sloping habitat in between the water and upland is called the Marsh Zone, arguably the most important habitat. The difference in elevation between low, mid, and high marsh is usually only a few centimeters, but for the plants and animals that live here, those few centimeters make a world of difference. The marsh may sometimes look lifeless, but it's actually the first building block for all wildlife in the estuary. Using sunlight, nutrients, and decayed plant material, marshes stimulate primary productivity, which is taken up by tiny organisms like copepods and amphipods, and then by invertebrates like worms, mussels, shrimp, and crabs. Those creatures then provide food for many other animals, including marine mammals, birds, and fish. In addition to food, marshes also provide nesting areas and refuge sites for birds during high tides. 80% of America's breeding bird population and half of the protected migratory bird species rely on coastal marshes and wetlands for food and shelter. Because marshes protect eggs and hatchlings from ocean currents and tides, these areas are also nurseries and juvenile habitat for species like Pacific herring, leopard sharks, bat rays, Dungeness crabs. Some fish use estuaries to travel back and forth between the ocean and their spawning grounds, like coho salmon and steelhead. Marshes also provide valuable ecosystem services, which are the benefits nature provides to people. So let's break down the top 5 ecosystem services that wetlands and marshes provide. Number 1, marshes filter pollutants. As water flows from upland channels and creeks through a salt marsh, grasses and peat, that mucky matrix of roots and decomposing material and soil, act as nature's kidneys, filtering pollutants like herbicides, pesticides, heavy metals, and excess nutrients from the water. That rotten egg smell you notice, well, that's the peat doing its thing, and it's actually a really good thing. Plus, that peat, along with marsh plants, keep the area wet and hydrated during periods of drought. Number 2, marshes store floodwaters. During large storms and flooding events, marshes act as a sponge, storing up to 1.5 million gallons of floodwaters in a single acre. Number 3, they reduce property damage. Because marshes border estuaries, they buffer the coastline from sea level rise and increased storm surges, absorbing wave energy, which can reduce nearby property damage by 20%. Number 4, they act as refuge sites and corridors. Marshes provide habitat for animals to escape during high tide and storm events, and are important corridors connecting wetland and upland zones. And lastly, but certainly not least, Marshes store carbon. Marsh plants breathe in carbon, removing it from the atmosphere and storing it in living vegetation and that amazing smelly peat. Each year, the equivalent of 900 million gallons of gasoline are taken up and absorbed by US wetlands and marshes. That takes every single car in the United States off the road for 3 days. And now let's hear a little bit from our resident climate expert, Sarah Hutto.
Thank you, Kate. And if you weren't impressed already with Kate's top 5 list of services that estuaries provide for people, we know that estuaries have been and continue to be really critical to human civilization because of where the largest, most successful cities are located. 22 of the 32 largest cities, so 2/3 in the world, are located right on estuaries, including New York City and Shanghai. But because of such close contact and continual use of the estuarine resources, it's not surprising that globally we've seen quite a decline in the health of estuaries and marsh and wetland habitat. Especially here in the Bay Area. Did you know San Francisco Bay is actually one really big estuary? Maybe you didn't because we have been altering it since the gold rush. Back then, the estuary had about 190,000 acres of tidal wetlands, which you can see in the light green color on the left map. But since then, we've built our cities and infrastructure right on top of that estuarine habitat. And so we've reduced our wetlands to just 40,000 acres today, which you can barely see kind of fringing the coastline. On top of these major changes that estuaries have experienced, they're also facing long-term, ongoing, persistent impacts due to climate change. We know that temperatures are increasing, and that's causing sea level rise. And thanks to an attendee from our first webinar of this series, we have this really great photo from last December showing the highest high tide of the year that sometimes is referred to as king tide at Stinson Beach, and you can see Bolinas Lagoon in the background there. You can see how far into the beach the waves are reaching on this high tide and what the water levels might look like on an everyday basis in the future. So we know sea levels are rising, but how do we know by how much they're going up? Well, tide gauges document daily water levels, and actually we have the oldest continually operating tide gauge in the Western Hemisphere right at our Greater Farallones office in San Francisco. It was built in 1854 to measure the tides just inside the Golden Gate so that ships could enter the bay. And it's been making daily water level measurements for so long that it has captured really clear evidence of this trend of rising sea level. 9 inches over the last 150 years to be exact. That might not sound like much, but it is accelerating, and among the many consequences will be impacts to habitats that are highly tuned to the water's edge, such as marshes and wetlands. So what sort of impacts are we talking about for marsh and wetland habitat? If you look at the images on the right side of your screen, these represent a really interesting study by the US Geological Survey that looked at a number of California's estuaries and modeled how likely they are to change with rising sea level. And so if you start at the image on the top, in 2010, there's a pretty good balance between low, mid, and high marsh. All of those habitats are well represented on the shoreline. But as waters rise, the USGS predicts by 2050 that almost all of that low marsh habitat will be completely lost. And as sea levels continue to rise further into 2100, something kind of counterintuitive happens. The mid-marsh and the high marsh areas become flooded so frequently that they actually convert back to low marsh. But without the diversity in the natural progression from low to mid to high marsh that we have today, you don't have a complete ecosystem, and you can't sustain the plants and animals that we really love about Bolinas Lagoon. And the lagoon also can't provide those wonderful ecosystem services that Kate described earlier. On the left, you can see with this simple figure how these habitats are lost as sea levels rise, along with all the plants and animals that are sustained by those different habitat types. Climate change will also likely bring increased storms, which increases not just the inundation and flooding of these habitats, but also exacerbates erosion of important marsh habitat. This all sounds a little dire, but thankfully, marsh habitats are actually incredibly resilient. And if we just give them a little boost, we can help nature take its course. This next photo shows a salt pond near Alviso in the south part of San Francisco Bay that was cut off from the estuary with a bunch of levees that were built during the gold rush era. And many of you might be familiar, the South Bay has quite a few of these salt ponds. As part of the largest tidal wetland restoration project on the West Coast, a local organization breached a levee in 2006, allowing water to naturally flood that site and once again deliver the sediment and the nutrients that used to be present before the levees were put in. And you can see that by 2008, the area had been nicely supplied with sediment. A year later, vegetation had started to grow along the channel edges. And by 2010, the marsh was already completely vegetated. Really quick recovery. So how does it do that? Well, we like to think of natural places as being pretty stable and static over time, but they're really not. Marshes grow by capturing sediment, and those gently sloping marsh zones can accumulate up to 5 millimeters of sediment per year. And in fact, they're the only habitat type that really grows like that. And when they have enough space, marshes can also migrate upslope, allowing them to keep pace with rising water levels. So marshes are really uniquely accustomed to recovering from disturbance. And if you can remove stressors and impacts, then these systems can recover, oftentimes on their own without any further intervention, and can maintain that resilience. This also helps alleviate future impacts from climate change. So in Bolinas Lagoon, if we plan ahead and act now, we can really take advantage of the lagoon's natural resilience and help these important places adapt to future challenges.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So how do we address these challenges? Historically, we've tried to save our habitat by building infrastructure like seawalls and bulkheads. But this hard infrastructure cuts off habitats from their food systems and the processes that allow them to survive in the first place. It also cuts off that sediment flow and that natural accumulation that Sarah mentioned. Over time, hard structures actually worsen erosion, like this photo of a seawall in Santa Barbara that's eroded the beach in front of it and left any chance for useful habitat long gone. High water levels and storms increase pressures on these structures and they start to crack and fail, as you can see here. Add on extreme disasters like this picture of a home in South Florida after Superstorm Sandy, and you get major erosion on the front and backside of the seawall. Hard infrastructure is called coastal armoring, but it's more like a short-term band-aid on a long-term problem. It's a temporary patch that doesn't eliminate the threat. It really just shifts the problem, erosion, to neighboring lands. So what's the solution? In recent years, there's been a movement away from hardened gray infrastructure toward techniques that use nature to help nature. These nature-based or green techniques are sometimes called living shorelines, which is a broad term for using natural elements like shells, woody debris, sand, and native plants to build habitats that stabilize the coast. Living shorelines can provide long-term protection, restore habitat, and increase biodiversity. They're often cheaper to construct, easier to maintain, and more scientifically sound than hard structures. Plus, they look natural, just like natural systems do, because they are natural systems, so you don't even notice that they're there. Living shorelines are more adaptable to sea level rise than seawalls because they can evolve and migrate inland. This also gives space for wildlife to migrate. Unlike hardened structures that begin to degrade with the impact of storms and currents and waves, living shorelines are better at withstanding impacts, and they can even repair themselves by capturing sediment and regrowing vegetation, like Sarah showed us. Over time, they can literally adapt themselves to accommodate the dynamics or stressors they face. So how do you build a living shoreline? Living shorelines are all about restoring habitat. So projects often involve enhancing or reshaping wetland and marsh zones and growing native vegetation. Reshaping can mean placing a thin layer of sediment on top of existing marsh, like this image from Seal Beach near San Diego, where you can see the vegetation starting to crop through recently applied sediment. You can also use oyster shells and fiber cores that can be implemented closer to the water column, and which encourages sediment capture and vegetation to grow behind them. Oyster shells can promote the growth of new oysters that further stabilize the shoreline and provide food sources. Fiber logs can break down, establish roots, and further secure the shoreline over time. A combination of green and gray techniques can also be used, like these rock sills that have gaps in between them to allow water, sediment, and wildlife access. So let's see two real-world examples. Okay, here are some photos along the Elizabeth River in Virginia that show the eroded shoreline in April 2017, restoration with vegetation and fiber logs, and a healthy living shoreline in May 2018 that took only 10 months for the marsh to grow and expand. These are photos from Surfers Beach down in Ventura, California, where a collapsed seawall had destroyed the beach and started to erode the parking lot and a bike path behind it, which you can see in the before photo on the left. The restoration included relocating that parking lot and bike path and building dunes and planting vegetation, as you can see on the photo on the right. Both of these projects used natural materials to restore habitat, and they provide a protective buffer because that's what living shorelines do. So, like Sarah said, if we act now, we can give the wetland and marsh habitat in Bolinas Lagoon a boost so it can sustain all the challenges it faces while still preserving all of the great benefits it provides. Speaking of benefits, when you all registered for the event, we asked you about the benefits you care about most when thinking about restoration projects, and here are your results. As you can see, most everyone prioritizes natural processes, improving habitat for wildlife, and addressing climate change. All things that living shorelines also address. And I did not make these answers up. These came straight from your responses. At our last event, we mentioned this guidance document, informally called the Locally Preferred Plan, which includes 20 plus project recommendations for Bolinas Lagoon. The plan was developed in partnership with Marin County, the sanctuary, other managing agencies, scientific experts, and community members. And it looks at the lagoon as an interconnected system and encourages all project recommendations to also consider natural processes, habitat for wildlife, and climate change planning. Our South End Living Shoreline project was taken originally from Project 6B listed within the plan. So we definitely encourage you to take a look in order to learn more, and Olivia or Elaine will drop a link into the chat right now so that you can access the plan. Okay, before we jump in to the South End Living Shoreline project, why don't we do a quick poll and see how familiar everyone is with the project at this point. So Olivia, do you mind opening up our poll question for us?
Yeah, no problem. All right, I've launched it now, so you can check one of the following. So like Kate said, We're looking to know how familiar are you with the South End Living Shoreline project? And I'll leave that open for about 30 more seconds.
Thank you, Olivia.
Yeah.
I'm interested to hear people's responses here. So
Yeah, it looks like about 85% of people have voted already. I'll give another couple seconds. But yeah, looks like we're staying around 85%. So I'll close the poll. Thank you guys for participating. And here are the results. So a majority of you have heard of it, but you just don't know much about it, which I think is a great starting point. And a couple of you have never heard about it. So let's see, let's have Kate
I'll tell you more
about it.
Yeah, you're all at the right place. So let's dive in. Okay, so we all want to preserve all of Bolinas Lagoon. So why focus on the south end? The key is that upland habitat that we talked about earlier. And this is a photo of a map of Bolinas Lagoon with all different colors representing different elevations. The upland habitat is represented in the orange and red color. So I'm going to use my mouse to navigate a little bit here. The shoreline along the southern end, as you can see, has a very long stretch of upland space. A lot of that orange color is located right there. This is the only place in the lagoon that has this much continuous space available. And habitats with more continuous space are more biodiverse. So this area really is just about the best location for a living shoreline to restore marsh and wetland habitat in order to kickstart all of those great benefits. When we zoom in, we can see this upland stretch even closer. So each of the colors here represents a different habitat type. Along the western shore of the shoreline here, we see green, which is represented by salt marsh. And then we see yellow right behind it, which is grassland or basically upland habitat. This area has healthy, gently sloping habitat that transitions from mudflat to marsh to upland. But as we travel down the shoreline, we turn the corner here, we notice that that green marsh color has essentially disappeared and we only have the yellow upland. The other colors along the shoreline represent the different tree communities, including non-native forest, which is represented by this sort of gray color. If I can get my mouse over there, this gray color here, kind of right where the shoreline takes a bend. Anyhow, the big thing here is that this entire eastern shore is missing that important green salt marsh. And that is because the shoreline is being carved away by tides and storms, which leads a really steep embankment, almost as tall as Sarah and I actually in that photo on the right. So here's another way to kind of look at that steep embankment. I'll walk us through this. Here are shoreline profiles taken at 7 different locations along the shoreline. The first 4 locations in the shades of red right here are along the eastern section of shoreline. And then the last 3 in green along here are from that gently sloping western section of shoreline. Each profile starts right at the edge of Dipsea Road and moves out towards the lagoon. So right over here where the graph is, this sort of represents the edge of Dipsea. And as we travel out towards the lagoon, you can see that the width of upland habitat is well over 100 feet before it starts to lose elevation and meet up with the ground floor, with the lagoon floor down here. So the biggest thing to take away here is that these green lines along the western shore gradually slope from upland down to the lagoon floor with roughly 80 feet of marsh space. And then those red profile lines from the eastern section drop off pretty suddenly only leaving about 30 to 50 feet of marsh space. And as you can tell, this drops off pretty suddenly. So that 30 to 50 feet of space is pretty vertical. It's not very suitable habitat for birds and other wildlife to use. So let's continue down the shoreline. And now we will move around to this corner right around here, where we have really important salt marsh and wetland habitat. But this area also undergoes its own pressures. It's often inundated during high tides and storms, and those waters often overtop the marsh. So we know all of the impacts, but what would we like to do with the South End Living Shoreline Project? The two goals of the Living Shoreline Project are, number one, we want to create that gently sloping marsh habitat along the eastern shore so that we can connect it with the healthy, gently sloping habitat along the eastern shore. This will help stabilize the shoreline, reduce erosion, while still providing a buffer zone against sea level rise. And then as we move around the corner to that wetland and marsh habitat over here, we want to enhance and elevate the existing wetland and marsh habitat so that it can keep pace with sea level rise and reduce the frequency and severity of habitat flooding. And of course, throughout the entire project area, we want to include native plantings with the help of volunteers. So that's one way to look at the project area. I think we should spruce things up a little bit even more. And Wendy can take us on our very own fly through of the project area. If I can swap screens.
Hi, Kate. Good evening, everyone. We're happy to have you here today. And I'll take you on a little flyover of the lagoon. It's nice to see in particular, it's kind of a tricky place to visualize if you haven't been there yourself. So we'll take a little flyover and tour of the project area. Our first stop here is that very southern end of the lagoon where the salt marsh is being drowned. And this corner of the lagoon is calm and quiet. And one of the design options here is to place a very thin layer of sediment on top of the existing marsh. And what that does is it simulates a more natural accumulation, and that kickstarts the growth and that more gradual sloping habitat. And when I say, placing a thin layer, it's typically done a couple inches at a time and is, something like less than a foot total. So, but slowly adding on, sort of simulating that natural process and just doing it a little faster and giving it a kickstart. But along with that, so you put the sediment, along with that, we add vegetation. And really vegetation and all those plants are really the key to holding the shoreline together. The roots and stalks of those marsh plants are what trap sediment that's suspended in the water. So the sediment flows into the lagoon, it has sand, the sand falls out, but that mud, those little particles, those stay suspended and then fall out when they hit the grasses and reeds type of things in the water. So vegetation is an important part of accumulating and stabilizing the shoreline. So as we fly a little further over here, we get to this long stretch of shoreline. And this is where Kate showed the picture of Sarah and her standing next to the eroding sandy banks. So this is more sandy material and less mud. But this area in particular could be really, really prime shorebird and waterbird habitat, but it has that steep bank that's blocking certain, parts of that marsh ramp from providing that habitat. So this is really the focus there. We could really make this into better habitat for the birds that inhabit the area. And the nice thing about this area is there's a little bit more wiggle room to work with because there's more natural shoreline here. You can see in really clearly here in the images. The design option here would be to create a more gently sloping shoreline instead of that steep, harsh angle of the bank. And again, plant native vegetation to hold it all together. And using native vegetation is really important for two reasons. The first is that it does a better job of holding the shoreline together. It's what was here originally, and so it's more suited to this particular environment. And secondly, it provides a higher quality habitat for the wildlife, right? This is the plants and the food and the vegetation that they're used to. So it fits better into the whole system. It's better for the overall ecology of the area. So native plants are really important. We would also remove some of the invasive species to make room for the natives. And Kate's done a bunch of this in other places in the lagoon, and it really works. So it's an important piece of the process. And this gradual sloping shoreline that we would build would have a variation in slope, not just completely flat, but building in some sort of rolling hills or some nooks and crannies. That is known to be beneficial for birds. It gives them variation in their habitat and gives them important food sources. So it would be designed natural and to have a little bit of variation to benefit the habitat. And you can see right in this image, actually, there's certain trees here that are very beloved by birds and by the community. And Kate and I have sat out there, and it's this beautiful, a bench under a nice shady tree that looks out, and you can spot birds and wildlife really well from there. And those are beloved, and so we would look into options to keeping them, even though they're not native to the area. And lastly, I think we're a little bit further down. But there's a beautiful walking path here. That's a great way to see wildlife. It's really beautiful. And that would be repaired and preserved. So that way that can still provide that great viewing area. As we're rounding this corner, we're getting to that healthy reference area that Kate mentioned earlier. And if you want to get an idea of what the ideal shoreline would look like for this area, we'll just keep flying over this healthy reference area. And you can kind of tell it doesn't have that sharp bank and that right angle edge. And it's got this gently sloping habitat that provides that ramp out of the water. So if these two areas are connected, we would have a total of 2 miles of continuous, healthy, sustainable marsh habitat, and that's our goal. The specific design, the exact specifics of which part of the shoreline is going to look, exactly like what is going to take a little bit more time to develop. You have to do more research on the ecology and, some engineering to work to figure out the stability of the right angles of the shoreline and that sort of thing. And also, gathering feedback from the community about what they want in the area. But the overarching goal is the one we keep talking about. We'd like to stabilize the shoreline by improving and restoring habitat. And creating that gently sloping, I really think of it like a boat ramp out of the water for wildlife, so that way when high water levels are there, they can get out of the water. So that completes our flyover. We can see the good aerial here, but I hope you like our vision for this healthy shoreline. Thanks.
Thank you, Wendy. Okay, hopefully I will be successfully transitioning back to the slides here. So you should be able to see our project map area there. Thank you so much for bringing us through the project area. I feel like that video, first of all, it's just a great video that really shows the area and gives everybody a sense of how much space we're actually working with and all the possibilities. So hopefully everybody learned a lot of information about the vision for the South End project. Let's talk about a few takeaways and then we will continue on with the project. So what did we learn today? Well, first takeaway is that we learned that nature is our best bet against future challenges. We also learned that marshes matter and that upland space is key. And that living shorelines, just like the South End Living Shoreline Project, can protect ecosystem services and provide many benefits to humans and wildlife communities. With your help, we can all help nature take its course. Okay, so what's next? In terms of next steps for the project, the next step is the feasibility study. It should take about 1 year to 2 years, where we'll analyze the current conditions of the project area and produce different project design options, similar to what Wendy talked about. She gave us a few examples of different design options we could use in different locations along the project area. All of the options will be evaluated based on several criteria. So adaptability to sea level rise and the total amount of habitat created, the ability for the shoreline to connect to other adjacent areas, and then of course things like cost and timeline. We are going to assess all of these options with our project partners, all of the landowners within the project area, all the managing agencies, and of course with the community. And at the end of that process, we'll select our preferred project design. Then we move on to the permitting and environmental compliance stage, which will also take about 2 years. During this stage, we work with agencies like the Army Corps, the Coastal Commission, the Sanctuary, Marin County, and a whole list of others. And we finalize important plans like our monitoring plan, our restoration plan. What does the vegetation plantings look like? We'd have a sediment plan if we do end up using that thin layer sediment placement as an option. And basically we'll make sure that all of the elements of our project avoid negative environmental impacts, not just to the project area, but to the surrounding areas as well. After we meet the local, state, and federal environmental requirements, we can begin the actual work and start restoration. That's why we'll have all of the great vegetation planting and help from volunteers and probably some local residents. And then that's followed by years of monitoring to ensure that our project is successful. And then of course, throughout the whole duration of the project, we'll continue community outreach and coordination with landowners and partner agencies. So that's kind of the wrap up of the South End Living Shoreline project as it stands right now. I hope everybody learned a lot of great information. I also hope you've been using the chat box to write some questions in, because now we are at our question and answer period. So I'm sure we have some good questions from folks. Wendy, do you mind helping me pick some questions from the chat box, and we can get some answers to everyone?
Yeah, yes, there are a couple interesting questions. I always love these. They're my favorite part to think. But this is a great one to start off with. I guess this is for Kate. What animals specifically will benefit from this?
What animals specifically? Okay. Okay, well, we already did talk about some of the fish and invertebrates that use those special nooks and crannies, especially to protect eggs and hatchlings. So we know that those types of creatures will benefit from increased marsh habitat. We also know that those creatures will create food sources for other animals, in particular birds, and a lot of birds will benefit from the project. So Bolinas Lagoon is a major stopover along the Pacific Flyway, which is basically the route that birds use to travel north and south along their long journeys in between seasons. We said earlier that the lagoon hosts 50,000 migrating birds a year. So many migrating birds, like some of the dabbling ducks, really enjoy shallow water habitat that marshes will provide. So pintail, bufflehead, teal species would definitely benefit from increased marsh habitat and some of that lower, more shallower water habitat. Also, other shorebirds and land birds, sparrows, wren tits, bush tits, egrets, herons, curlews, you know, all will use the area not just because they can forage and find food, but they can also rest and nest and roost and just enjoy that whole long continuous span of marsh habitat that we hope to create. And same thing with some of those trees that we mentioned. A lot of those trees are utilized by several bird species. And really by attracting a lot more birds to the project area, that's also going to attract some birds of prey, predatory birds like hawks, the beautiful bald eagle. So if we help one species, we'll basically be really helping them all. In order to restore marsh habitat, we realize that that's kind of the beginning of the food chain for estuaries. So many different species, whether birds, invertebrates, or fish, will really benefit from the project.
Great. I'm really impressed by your encyclopedic knowledge of the birds. But you
I'm sure
certainly
there's some people.
getting
I'm sure there's some people in the audience who probably know pretty well too. So
That's true. There's a lot to see out there. Maybe that's the most striking thing the three of us noticed when we're doing field work out there together is the birds and
yes,
wide variety of how beautiful they are.
yes, they're indicator species. So if they're around, that means that it must be good habitat, must be a cool place to be. So
Great. Okay. We look through the questions here. What happens? Oh, Sarah, you're here. Good thing you're here. What happens to the carbon in the plants and mud when a road is built?
good
That is
question. I want to hear this answer.
That's a great question, and it is a big concern for managers that want to keep carbon where it is, so to speak. So when a marsh and that really carbon-rich sediment and marsh plants are disturbed, like for building a road, or if the marsh is drained for whatever reason, that carbon that was locked away pretty permanently is now at risk of being released back into the atmosphere when it's disturbed. So you actually take a marsh, which is acting like a carbon sponge and helping us with our climate mitigation goals and absorbing CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it away. You actually turn that into a carbon source, and then it actually starts emitting carbon into the atmosphere. So not only do you take away its ability to absorb carbon, but now you've turned it into a source of carbon for the atmosphere. So it's kind of two hits against you. So I think it's really critical that we restore areas and we build up our marshes and create more marshes. But it's also just as important that the marshes we do have, we make sure we protect them. And we try to limit any disturbance to those really critical areas.
Also, that's a great question and a great answer. That's a good good explanation of that. Thanks, Sarah. We've got a lot flooding in here. Here's a fun one for you, Kate. Where does the funding for this project come from? Thank you.
Oh boy, how fun is that? Funding is so fun. You can't spell funding without fun. That's a great question. So we really want to leverage all different types of funding for the project. It's any restoration project can be pretty costly, and each stage that I laid out in our timeline there obviously has a price tag associated with it. So we will look to various sources of funding. We have a lot of in-kind support from a lot of our project partners, which helps lift some of that load. We also are applying to a variety of grants, local, state, federal, for funds to help support each stage of the project. And also looking to private support from folks who are interested in helping the project. We do get some funds coming in each year that are relatively consistent. So we've been able to maintain funding for the project, and obviously we've gotten it to this step. But we are going to need some help and major inputs of funds as each step continues. So we will look to all areas for sources of funds, and we'll definitely be leveraging all of the partners and people involved in the project in order to get the project done, get it done in an effective and efficient amount of time, and get it done right.
Excellent, great answer. And I think this is a good question. This is the one, Kate, that I think you get fairly frequently around the lagoon, and it's about the lagoon silting up. So there's the question is, it's well known that one of the biggest problems facing the lagoon is that it's silting up. How is this project not going to make that issue worse? And I think this is something, right, that you tend to speak to fairly often.
Yeah, definitely. Historically, well, maybe not that long ago, I'm sure some people remember, back in 2002, the Army Corps of Engineers put together a draft feasibility study, and they recommended actually dredging the lagoon in order to address that issue of the siltation or the sediment filling up. And when they proposed that option, they suggested like 1.4 million cubic yards of sediment be removed from the lagoon. And a lot of people, including scientific experts and a lot of the managing agencies and community members, you know, were pretty concerned about that. Not only because if you just scoop everything out of the lagoon, it's likely just going to fill up again, but you're also disturbing any species or habitat that's under the water surface there. Not to mention, it's an ongoing cost because sediment is coming into the lagoon through the inlet. 80% of the sediment is coming in and out through the lagoon inlet. Only about 20% is coming through all of the different tributaries, the different creeks and streams that kind of flow into the lagoon. So I think, you know, 20 years ago or so, we really were worried about the lagoon filling in. There's been some surveys by USGS that have actually shown that although sediment does shift and move around the lagoon, the actual amount has actually stayed pretty steady. I know it doesn't look like that from day to day, but overall, when you look at it from a larger snapshot over time, there has been sort of an equilibrium there. And as we start to think about climate change, I think Sarah made this point well, sediment really matters, and we actually need that material in order for our habitats to keep pace with sea level rise. So we kind of do need to rethink about the way we look at sediment and the lagoon silting up. You know, San Francisco Bay is pretty sediment starved. They actually need more material in order to try and have some of their habitats, especially around the fringe, keep up with sea level rise and not drown as the water levels rise. So I think we're actually pretty lucky in Bolinas Lagoon to have material that we can use, especially along that southern shoreline where we know it's going to be so important in order to keep pace. And in order to allow the marshes to evolve. So I don't know if I answered your question. I'm sure I gave some information in there. Hopefully you got a good nugget of a response. Yeah, I think kind of the big overarching thought is that we really do need to rethink our opinions on sediment because of some of these likely impacts we're going to face due to climate change.
Yeah, excellent. The excellent and thorough explanation of that. It's been interesting coming into learning about it from you. And that is the sort of confusing history, and that has happened elsewhere too, right? That there's sort of competing issues, and then currently sea level rises, you know, that's the one that sort of takes over in you know, being the top of the list. That really, there's been a couple of questions that sort of ties into this other theme that's been popping up. And you know, it's what kind of sediment will you put on the marsh? And I think that gets, I'll just answer this one really quickly. And it gets to what you're saying. You know, we have to, if we're putting a thin layer of sediment or fixing, you know, resloping shorelines in places, we need sediment to do that. And, you know, it's a resource that we have to think about conserving because we're going to need it. As you mentioned, the bay, you know, areas in the lagoon, it has to be clean sediment. It has to be tested. There's lots of restrictions about what type of sediment and the quality. But if you have good, clean, quality sediment that matches the area that you'd like to place it, you can go through a process to place, you know, sediment from elsewhere to help restore and build up habitat. So I think that goes with what you're saying, and sort of highlights how important it is to think about the sediment and what is available. And
Definitely. Yeah, I think you know, there's a movement for sort of what's called beneficial reuse of sediment. So there's lots of projects that actually have to remove sediment, and so we could potentially have a source from another project where we might be able to use it here at our South End project. You know, obviously there's going to be other options as well. Maybe it's not just a thin layer sediment placement that we're going to do. There's other things that we can do to try and help raise the elevation of marsh habitat. So That's just one living shoreline technique. You know, we could use, like I mentioned earlier, those oyster shells and the fiber cores. They actually help accrue sediment, because when water washes over those shells and those fiber cores, sediment comes with it, and then it settles out behind those cores and those bags of oyster shells. So you get that kind of natural elevation building just through the natural processes, and having those fiber cores and the oyster shell bags help to trap the sediment that's already there. So depending on all of the different options that we look into, sediment placement might be one of them, fiber cores might be one of them. There's other techniques you can use just to encourage vegetation itself to grow over, say, woody debris. There's like a technique called lattice arboring, where you can kind of use woody debris that encourages the encroachment of plants on top of that. So you're getting that elevation raise just from sort of vegetation alone. And then the vegetation itself can help capture increased sediment. So there's a lot of different options that we would look into. And along with that, we would look into every single step involved in the process. So where would we get the material that we're using? How are we going to test that material? Where do we store that material? How are we going to actually place that material? All of that gets ironed out through the feasibility study process, and as we do all of the permitting and environmental compliance.
Great, and I think that's a good wrap up here. I guess I'm looking at the time, and we have a couple more questions, but perhaps we should maybe answer those via your newsletter.
Okay, yeah. We'll send out another newsletter for everybody, answering some more of the questions that we got. I really want to make sure that we do get to everyone's questions. So thank you though, Wendy, for fielding those for us. And you're right, we are just about at 7 o'clock right now. So I do want to say thank you to everybody so much for joining our afternoon at the lagoon, third part in our virtual series here. And I will just send it over to Deb for a few closing remarks.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks for all the great questions. I know there are some that we weren't able to get to, and we would love to follow up with you. I'm happy to do that, or Kate by email, or for questions where several people asked them, maybe they would be good topics for the e-news. Especially, I just want to take a moment to address the question about funding, and say that when it gets to the actual restoration part down the road, where we're doing the work, that's a time when it's easier to get grants for the actual implementation. But over the next couple of years, as we get busy with the feasibility study, that's the part that's not as attractive to big institutional funding sources. And not surprisingly, we will be coming to you for your continued help. Those of you who have invested in the past, and for those of you who haven't, but you're interested in being a partner, we'll really welcome that. The community is going to benefit for years to come, and be just a critical partner in making it happen. So hope you've learned a lot. I have, and I want to thank Kate and the staff for putting together such a pretty and informative presentation. And thank you all for spending your afternoon at the Bolinas Lagoon with us. It's been a pleasure. Look forward to talking to you soon. Call or email us anytime. Okay, thanks so much. Take care and have a good night.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.